Hey guys, tonight we ease ourselves back in time, way back. Imagine, if you will, stepping onto a dusty, uneven boardwalk in some bustling American town, perhaps around 1910. The air is thick with the smell of coal smoke, horse manure, and maybe a hint of something vaguely medicinal from the local apothecary. You hear the clang of a streetcar bell, the distant chug of an early automobile, and the general din of commerce and conversation. It feels vibrant, chaotic, and utterly unregulated by today's standards. Yet beneath that surface chaos lay a bewildering, often contradictory, layer of rules, local ordinances, state statutes, and municipal mandates that govern nearly every aspect of life. You might think you're just taking a stroll, but you could be inadvertently breaking 3 different laws you never even knew existed, potentially earning you a stern lecture, a fine, or worse. You probably won't survive this legal minefield unscathed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling up to it, why not drop your location and the time you're listening? It's always cool to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you settle in, picture this rapidly changing America. The turn of the 20th century was a period of explosive growth and transformation. Cities were swelling, technology was leaping forward at a dizzying pace, and people were grappling with all the new complexities this brought. And where there are new complexities, there are inevitably new rules. But unlike today, where federal laws and state statutes often set broad standards, the early 1900s saw an absolute explosion of local lawmaking. Town councils, city aldermen, county supervisors, they were all busy bees, churning out regulations to address everything from the truly pressing issues of public health and safety to the seemingly trivial annoyances of daily life. It was a legal landscape less like a carefully planned garden and more like a patch of wild, overgrown weeds, with different species popping up haphazardly in every municipality. Think about it. You could cross a county line and suddenly find yourself under an entirely different set of rules about how fast you could ride your bicycle, what time stores had to close on a Sunday, or even how loudly you were allowed to sing in the street. This wasn't just about major crimes, it was about the fabric of everyday existence. The sheer volume and hyperspecificity of these laws reflected a society trying desperately to get a handle on rapid change, often through the most granular possible means. It was an era where local government truly meant local government, with ordinances crafted to solve problems specific to Main Street, any town, USA, whether that problem was too many stray dogs, not enough street lamps, or the persistent issue of citizens spitting on the sidewalks. This localized legislative frenzy was partly a consequence of the American system itself, with its emphasis on states' rights and municipal autonomy. But it was also a reflection of the times. There wasn't the instantaneous communication we have today. Legal precedent and best practices didn't zip across the nation at the speed of light. So, a town in Ohio might enact a law dealing with a specific problem, completely unaware that a town in Kansas had tried the exact same thing 5 years earlier and found it utterly unenforceable, or even counterproductive. This led to a fascinating, often bewildering, patchwork quilt of regulations, full of contradictions and strange, isolated legal islands. Historians still argue whether this wave of hyper-specific local legislation was primarily a genuine attempt at social engineering for the common good, a reaction driven by fear of the unknown, like new technologies or immigrant populations, or simply the result of local power brokers enacting rules that benefited their specific interests. It was likely a messy mix of all three, filtered through the unique quirks and prevailing moral panic of each individual community. For instance, you might find a town council grappling with the advent of electric streetlights. Do you need a law saying who pays for them? A law about how bright they can be? A law forbidding kids from climbing the poles? Yes, and probably yes if you were legislating back then. Every new invention, every shift in social behavior, every perceived nuisance seemed to trigger a flurry of legal activity at the local level. It was almost as if lawmakers felt they had to do something, anything, to show they were in control of a world that felt increasingly out of it. This wasn't just about big cities either. Small towns and rural counties got in on the act, passing laws about everything from fence heights to livestock roaming freely. The quirkier the local issue, it seemed, the more specific the resulting law tended to be. Imagine being a traveling salesman during this era. You'd need not only a good map but perhaps also a compendium of local ordinances just to make sure you weren't accidentally violating some obscure rule about peddling your wares or parking your horse and buggy, or maybe your early Model T. It must have been exhausting trying to keep up. It makes you appreciate the relative uniformity of laws today, doesn't it? Though sometimes you might stumble across a strange, old ordinance still technically on the books and wonder what on earth prompted that particular piece of legislation in the first place. That's exactly the rabbit hole we're diving down tonight. We're peeling back the layers of time to explore the specific problems, fears, and sometimes just plain silliness that gave rise to these now forgotten laws. They offer a unique, often humorous, window into the anxieties and aspirations of early 20th century Americans. So, let's settle in and see what peculiar legal gems we can unearth together from this fascinating, rule-obsessed era. So, you've navigated the general legal minefield of 1910s America, perhaps avoiding fines for singing too loudly or jaywalking in a particularly strict town. But just as you start to feel comfortable with the cobblestones and the clip-clop of horses, something new rumbles onto the scene. Something noisy, smelly, and frankly, terrifying to many people, the automobile. The horseless carriage. This wasn't just a new mode of transport. It was a disruption, a mechanical beast that didn't understand the established rules of the road, which, let's be honest, were mostly based on centuries of dealing with things pulled by animals. And where there's disruption, there's a desperate rush to regulate. The early laws governing automobiles are a perfect, sometimes hilarious, example of this era's legislative panic. Imagine you're a lawmaker in a small town in, say, Indiana, around 1905. You've got your hands full with sanitation, fire codes, maybe that persistent issue with loose pigs. Then, suddenly, a contraption that looks like a fancy buggy without a horse comes rattling through Main Street at a speed that seems utterly reckless, maybe 10 or 15 miles per hour. Horses rear up, dogs bark furiously, pedestrians dive for cover. Your constituents are demanding something be done. But what? There's no precedent for this. You can't just apply the laws for wagons or bicycles. This thing is completely different. This is how you get laws that, in retrospect, seem utterly baffling. Take speed limits. In some places, the initial speed limit wasn't set by miles per hour, but by how quickly you could stop the car. Seriously. You had to be able to stop. Within a reasonable distance. Or immediately. Which is about as clear as mud and entirely dependent on the driver, the car, and the road conditions. Other places were more specific, but often ludicrously slow. 5 miles per hour in the city, 10 in the country. That's barely faster than a brisk walk. There's a famous, and possibly apocryphal, but widely reported, story about a law in Pennsylvania that required a driver to send up a flare every mile, and then wait 10 minutes for the road to clear. Now, that's a scenic drive. But the truly bizarre laws often stemmed from the car's interaction with the established order, specifically, horses. Horses were everywhere. They were the engine of commerce and transportation. Cars were a menace to them. So, laws popped up requiring drivers to stop their cars dead, pull over to the side, and even shut off their engines if they saw a horse approaching that appeared spooked. In some towns, the driver even had to get out and help lead the horse past the terrifying metal beast. You can picture it, right? A dignified gentleman in a duster and goggles wrestling with a frightened mare while his sputtering automobile sits uselessly by the roadside. It must have been quite a scene. One of the most widely cited, though again, potentially exaggerated, laws was the requirement for someone to walk in front of the car, waving a red flag or lantern, to warn people, and horses, of its approach. While a literal flag-bearer law might not have been universally enforced, or even passed in many places, the idea behind it, that cars were so inherently dangerous and novel they needed a human herald, reflects the genuine anxiety of the time. It's like needing a town crier to announce your Wi-Fi signal. Mainstream historical fact time. While early automobiles were expensive and rare, their numbers grew rapidly. By 1910, there were over 450,000 registered automobiles in the U.S., a massive jump from just a few thousand a decade earlier. This sudden proliferation in cities and towns that were built for horses and pedestrians created immediate infrastructure and legal challenges, forcing lawmakers to scramble. This wasn't a slow, gradual change. It was a revolution happening in real time on Main Street. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some early laws didn't just regulate how you drove, but who could drive or what the car had to have. For example, a law in Vermont required drivers to prove their moral character before getting a license. Forget parallel parking, could you pass the virtue test? And in some places, cars were required to have a bell or horn, but there were also laws limiting how loud that horn could be, presumably to avoid further terrifying the aforementioned horses or perhaps just the easily startled town elders. Imagine trying to navigate a busy street while honking a horn specifically designed not to be alarming. "Excuse me, coming through with my mildly suggestive ding-dong." Historians still argue whether these early, restrictive automobile laws were primarily a sincere attempt to protect public safety and integrate a dangerous new technology responsibly, or if they were influenced by powerful interests like railway companies or livery stable owners who saw the car as a threat to their businesses. It was likely a complex mix, with genuine fear of accidents mingling with economic protectionism and a healthy dose of Luddite-esque suspicion of the newfangled contraption. The lack of standardization was another huge issue. Every state, every county, sometimes even every city had its own rules. Getting a driver's license wasn't a national or even statewide standard initially. It was a local affair, if required at all. Some places had age limits, others didn't. Some required a test, of varying difficulty, from demonstrating you wouldn't run people over to answering questions about moral philosophy. Apparently, others just required you to pay a fee. This legal chaos made interstate, or even inter-county, travel a bureaucratic nightmare. You might be a perfectly legal driver in your hometown, but a scofflaw the moment you crossed the county line into a jurisdiction that had different rules about everything from your license plate, if you even had one, as they weren't initially standard, to the type of headlights you needed. These early laws also reflected the class divide of the era. Cars were expensive toys for the wealthy before mass production made them more accessible. So, some regulations might have implicitly targeted this new class of noisy, fast-moving citizens disrupting the peace of established communities. Was that law about stopping for horses really about horse safety? Or was it a subtle way to make driving inconvenient for the rich folks zooming through town? Probably both, because life, and lawmaking, is rarely simple. Looking back, these laws seem quaint, even comical. But they were the first awkward steps in regulating a technology that would completely reshape the world. They show a society grappling, often clumsily, with the future barreling down the road towards them, quite literally. From mandatory flag bearers to virtue tests for drivers, the legal response to the automobile in the early 20th century was a prime example of localized, specific, and sometimes utterly absurd lawmaking born from necessity, fear, and a complete lack of foresight about just how dominant the car would become. It makes you thankful for standardized traffic laws, even if you still grumble about speed traps. At least you don't need to carry a red flag. So, you've just dodged a speeding automobile, going a terrifying 12 miles per hour, and navigated the treacherous legal waters of early traffic laws. You breathe a sigh of relief, perhaps leaning against a lamppost to collect yourself. But don't get too comfortable, because the legal dangers in 1910's America weren't just external, like cars or rogue livestock. They were also tied to your very own bodily functions, particularly one that was considered a major public nuisance and health hazard: spitting. Yes, spitting. It sounds trivial now, but in this era, it was a battleground for public health and social order, leading to some truly pervasive and peculiar laws. Walk down that same dusty boardwalk or step into a crowded streetcar, and you'll notice something everywhere: spittoons. Brass, porcelain, even plain tin ones, strategically placed in hotels, saloons, train stations, banks, and public buildings. They were a necessary evil, a tacit acknowledgement of a widespread habit. Because, let's be frank, people in the early 20th century spat a lot. Chewing tobacco was common, leading to frequent expectoration. But beyond that, public spitting was simply a less taboo behavior than it is today. However, as cities grew denser and understanding of germ theory began to spread, slowly and unevenly, this habit started to be seen not just as rude, but as deadly. Mainstream historical fact time. The fear driving these anti-spitting laws was primarily tuberculosis, often called consumption. This airborne disease was a major killer in the early 20th century, particularly in crowded urban areas. Public health officials and a growing number of concerned citizens believed, correctly, that spitting spread the bacteria, especially when dried sputum turned to dust and was inhaled. So, banning spitting wasn't just about aesthetics. It was a genuine, if sometimes heavy-handed, attempt to curb a deadly epidemic. This newfound fear translated into a flurry of legislation. City councils and state legislatures began enacting anti-spitting ordinances, or sanitary codes, across the country. Suddenly, that casual expectoration you might have done without a second thought could land you in hot water. Signs started appearing everywhere. Do not spit on the sidewalk, spitting forbidden, spit in cuspidor only. Cuspidor, by the way, is just a fancy word for spittoon. You might see a police officer or a specially appointed sanitary inspector eyeing you suspiciously, ready to enforce the new rules. Imagine getting a ticket for that. Excuse me, sir, I'm afraid I'll have to cite you for excessive expectoration near a public thoroughfare. It sounds like something out of a comedy sketch, but it was a real concern. The laws weren't always uniform, of course. Some towns banned spitting only on sidewalks. Others extended it to streetcar floors, train platforms, theater lobbies, or any indoor public space. Penalties varied wildly too. A few dollars fine in one place, a stern warning in another, and maybe even a night in the local lockup if you were a repeat offender or particularly defiant. Try explaining that arrest to your family. Well, honey, I was just minding my own business, reflecting on the state of the world, and well, you know. Nature called. And apparently, the town of Oakhaven has a zero-tolerance policy. Quirky tidbit. Some laws got incredibly specific. While most targeted general spitting, a few ordinances specifically mentioned expectorating tobacco juice. This highlighted the link to chewing tobacco, but also perhaps targeted a particular demographic or habit seen as less refined. In some places, enforcement was handled by streetcar conductors, who were given the authority to eject passengers caught spitting on the floor. Imagine the tension on your commute. Are you going to get kicked off the trolley for a minor salivary infraction? It adds a whole new layer of stress to rush hour. Historians still argue whether these widespread anti-spitting laws were truly effective in curbing disease transmission or if they were more successful as a form of social engineering, promoting cleanliness and discouraging behaviors seen as lower class or uncivilized. While public health campaigns emphasizing germ theory certainly played a role, the sheer volume, and sometimes overzealous enforcement of these laws suggests they also serve to reinforce burgeoning middle-class RMS of hygiene and public decorum in rapidly urbanizing environments. It was about making cities not just healthier, but also, in the eyes of some, more respectable. Beyond tuberculosis, the general push for sanitation laws reflected a broader societal shift. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw increased understanding of how germs spread, leading to regulations about everything from food handling to waste disposal. But spitting remained a highly visible, person-to-person vector that lawmakers felt they could directly control. It was easier to pass a law saying, "Don't spit here," than it was to overhaul complex sewage systems or ensure universal access to clean water. So, spitting became a legislative low-hanging fruit, tackled with varying degrees of success and logic. Consider the logistics of enforcement. How do you catch a spit law violator? It requires constant vigilance from police or inspectors. And what constitutes spitting? A full-on expectoration? A quick, discreet deposit? The ambiguity must have led to some interesting legal arguments and perhaps a few instances of mistaken identity. "No, officer, that wasn't me. That was just a particularly damp gust of wind." These laws also intersected with other regulations. Remember those blue laws about Sunday closures? Maybe spitting was seen as even more egregious on the Sabbath. Or perhaps a law banning loud singing in the street also included a clause about noisy or offensive bodily expulsions. You had to be careful not just what came out of your mouth in song, but also what came out in other ways. It makes you appreciate the relative freedom of expression and expectoration, if you were so inclined, you have today. Though you might still get a dirty look if you spit on the sidewalk, some social norms stick around, even when the laws fade. The legacy of these anti-spitting laws is visible even now. While the strict ordinances are largely gone, though some cities still have them technically on the books, the cultural taboo against public spitting remains strong in many Western societies. We've internalized the idea that it's unsanitary and impolite, a direct result of decades of public health campaigns and legal pressure from this era. It's a quiet victory for those early 20th century lawmakers, even if they didn't eradicate tuberculosis solely by banning spitting. They did, however, change public behavior in a significant way. So, as you continue your imaginary journey through this fascinating legal landscape, be mindful of where you step, and where you choose to, well, you know. The ground beneath your feet isn't just dirt and cobblestones. It's also the site of countless minor legislative battles over hygiene, disease, and the very definition of public order. And compared to navigating the rules of spitting, those early automobile laws almost seem straightforward. Almost. Just don't let the streetcar conductor see you. So, you've successfully navigated the perils of early automobile traffic and managed to keep your bodily fluids in check, avoiding a potentially embarrassing citation for improper expectoration. You might think you're getting the hang of this early 20th century legal maze. But then Sunday rolls around, and suddenly, the rules change again, often dramatically. Welcome to the era of blue laws, where the Sabbath cast a long, restrictive shadow over daily life, leading to some truly baffling regulations about what you could and couldn't do on the Lord's Day. Blue laws, sometimes called Sunday laws, were rooted in religious tradition, specifically the Puritan idea of keeping the Sabbath holy. They weren't new to the early 1900s, but this period saw them enforced with varying degrees of rigor and applied to a rapidly modernizing society, leading to some awkward clashes between old-fashioned piety and emerging leisure activities and commerce. The basic idea was simple. Sunday was a day of rest and worship, not work or frivolous entertainment. But translating that simple idea into specific laws for a bustling town or city was anything but simple. Imagine you wake up on a Sunday morning in this era. You can't just pop down to the corner store for a newspaper or a loaf of bread. Chances are, it's legally required to be closed. Forget about retail therapy. Shopping was largely forbidden. Want to catch a baseball game or go to the theater? Probably illegal. Need to get some work done? Unless it was deemed absolutely essential, like farming tasks or tending to the sick, work was often off limits. It was a legally enforced day of quietude, whether you liked it or not. And the laws regulating this quietude could get incredibly specific, reflecting local interpretations of religious doctrine, community values, and perhaps a touch of busybody interference. Mainstream historical fact time. While the strictness varied by state and municipality, nearly all states had some form of Sunday closing laws in the early 20th century. These laws were frequently challenged in courts, often on grounds of religious freedom, particularly by Jewish merchants who observed the Sabbath on Saturday, or economic fairness, but they were consistently upheld by the Supreme Court throughout this period, which ruled that they served a legitimate secular purpose in providing a uniform day of rest for the population, regardless of their religious beliefs. The oddities arose when lawmakers tried to define exactly what constituted work or frivolous entertainment. Was selling ice cream illegal, but selling medicine okay? Could you buy a train ticket, but not a magazine? These distinctions often felt arbitrary and led to some head-scratching situations. In some places, you couldn't sell groceries, but restaurants could serve meals, though perhaps without certain types of entertainment. Bakeries might be allowed to sell bread in the morning but had to close by a certain hour. The rules were a patchwork quilt of exceptions and prohibitions, often based on local customs, or the lobbying efforts of specific businesses or religious groups. Quirky tidbit: some blue laws targeted specific forms of entertainment deemed particularly sinful or noisy. You might find laws banning public dancing on Sundays, forbidding the playing of musical instruments in public parks, or even regulating the volume of singing inside private homes if it was deemed disruptive to the Sabbath peace. Imagine getting a knock on the door from the local constable because your enthusiastic rendition of a hymn was excessively boisterous for a Sunday afternoon. Or perhaps your attempt at a quiet game of cards with friends was interrupted because it was considered gambling, or simply non-essential leisure. It was a time when even your private pursuits could fall under the long arm of Sunday law. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation behind the strict enforcement of blue laws in this era was genuine religious conviction and a desire to protect a traditional day of rest, or if it was more about controlling social behavior, particularly among immigrant populations with different cultural practices, or even about giving established businesses a day off from competition. It was likely a complex interplay of these factors, with religious groups often leading the charge for stricter laws, while reformers saw them as a way to ensure workers had a mandated day off, and social conservatives viewed them as essential for maintaining moral order. The enforcement of these laws could be inconsistent. In some areas, they were strictly policed, with businesses fined and individuals arrested for violations. In others, they were largely ignored, especially in more diverse or less religiously observant communities. This inconsistency added another layer of confusion. You might be able to buy a cigar on Sunday in one town, but face a fine for doing the exact same thing just a few miles down the road. It made spontaneous Sunday road trips legally hazardous. Consider the impact on businesses. For many, Sunday was a potentially lucrative day, especially as leisure time increased. Being forced to close meant lost income. This led to ongoing tension between religious groups advocating for strict observance and business owners pushing for more relaxed rules. The debates over Sunday laws were often heated, playing out in town hall meetings and newspaper editorials across the country. These laws also highlight the different pace of life. In a world without 24/7 convenience stores or online shopping, a mandated day of rest felt different. It shaped the rhythm of the week in a way that's hard to imagine today. You had to plan ahead, making sure you had groceries, medicine, or anything else you might need before Sunday dawned. It forced a collective pause, whether welcomed or resented. The absurdity often peaked with the exceptions. Why could you sell a shovel but not a rake on Sunday? Why was it okay to sell ice for chilling drinks, but not the drinks themselves? These fine-grained distinctions, often written into the laws themselves, revealed the difficulty lawmakers had in applying a broad moral principle to the messy realities of commerce and daily life. It's like trying to legislate which specific thoughts you're allowed to have on a Tuesday. Good luck with that. While most strict blue laws have faded or been repealed, their legacy lingers in some places, particularly regarding alcohol sales on Sundays. But the early 20th century versions were far more pervasive, touching almost every aspect of public and commercial life. They offer a fascinating glimpse into a society where religious observance was deeply intertwined with civil law, and where the attempt to legislate morality and behavior on a specific day of the week led to a maze of specific, often forgotten, rules that made simply existing on a Sunday a potential legal challenge. Just try not to look like you're having too much fun, or you might need a lawyer. Okay, you've survived Sunday, avoided spitting fines, and somehow navigated the terrifyingly slow, yet legally complex, world of early automobiles. You might be feeling like you're finally getting a handle on the strange legal landscape of 1910s America. But just as you relax, remember that this era wasn't just populated by people and machines. It was still heavily reliant on, and often overrun by, animals. Horses were everywhere, the primary engine of transportation and commerce. But beyond the noble steed, you'd find cows grazing on the edge of town, chickens scratching in backyards, pigs rooting around near the market, and dogs of every shape and size roaming the streets. And where there are animals interacting with a rapidly urbanizing human population, there are, inevitably, laws. Specific, often frustrated, laws aimed at controlling creatures who, frankly, had little respect for human legislation. Imagine the scene. You're walking down that boardwalk, perhaps dodging a discarded spittoon, when you hear it, the insistent yap 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 of a small dog, or maybe the low, mournful howl of a hound. Dogs were common, and often less contained than they are today. Their barking wasn't just an annoyance, it was a nuisance, a disruption of the peace, and in an era trying to impose order on chaotic growth, nuisances were ripe for regulation. Thus, laws popped up specifically targeting canine cacophony. Some towns had ordinances against excessive, or continuous, barking, leaving it up to the discretion of a weary constable or annoyed neighbor to decide what qualified. Others might have had rules about dogs running loose, requiring them to be leashed or confined, a concept that was far from universal at the time. Enforcing these laws must have been a nightmare. How do you serve a summons to a particularly vocal terrier? Did they find the dog or its owner? Probably the owner, though finding the dog feels more in line with the absurdity of the era. All right, Fido, that'll be $2 for disturbing the peace. And stop looking at me like that, you know what you did. But dogs were just the beginning. Livestock presented a different, often larger, set of problems. Cows, pigs, and chickens weren't confined to rural farms. They were often kept within town limits, especially in smaller communities or on the fringes of larger ones. A cow wandering into the street wasn't just a traffic hazard. Imagine it meeting one of those early automobiles. It was a potential source of property damage if it decided your prize-winning petunias looked particularly tasty. Laws quickly emerged to prevent livestock from roaming freely. These were often called stock laws, or no-fence laws, requiring owners to keep their animals enclosed, rather than relying on neighbors to fence their property out. Mainstream historical fact time. Before the widespread adoption of the automobile and the decline of urban agriculture, livestock, particularly horses, were integral to city life. Cities had stables, blacksmiths, and feed stores within their core. The sheer volume of animal traffic and waste created significant sanitation and logistical challenges, making animal control laws not just about nuisance, but fundamental urban management. Laws regulating everything from where horses could be hitched to how manure piles had to be managed were essential, if often overlooked today. The laws surrounding animals weren't always just about control. They could also touch upon welfare, though often in ways that seem minimal by modern standards. Early anti-cruelty laws existed, but they were often loosely enforced and focused on egregious acts rather than general neglect. However, some specific regulations did address conditions, like ensuring animals had access to water or weren't overworked. But the bulk of the legislation seemed focused on the animal's impact on human life and property. Quirky tidbit: some towns had incredibly specific rules about which animals were allowed within town limits, or where they could go. There are reports of ordinances banning pigs from certain streets, or requiring chickens to be kept in coops at all times. One particularly memorable, and possibly apocryphal, like many of these laws, story mentions a town that had a law forbidding donkeys from sleeping in bathtubs. Now you have to wonder, what specific incident prompted that piece of legislation? Was there a rash of donkey in bathtub incidents? Did someone's prize-winning mule decide the clawfoot tub was the height of equine luxury? The mind boggles at the origin story for such a rule. It perfectly encapsulates the idea that these laws often arose from very specific, local problems, no matter how bizarre they seem to us today. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of strict animal control laws in urban and suburban areas was primarily driven by genuine concerns for public health, safety, and sanitation, getting rid of manure, preventing disease spread, reducing traffic accidents, or if they were also a tool for social stratification and control, aimed at making towns appear more modern and less rural, thereby implicitly targeting poorer residents or recent immigrants who were more likely to keep livestock for subsistence. It was likely a complex mix, with different motivations dominating in different communities. Think about the practicalities again. A law against cows roaming? Sounds simple enough. But what if a cow escapes? Is the owner liable for every daisy it eats or every carriage it delays? What if it wanders across a county line with different rules? This patchwork of regulations meant that an animal perfectly legally grazing in one field might be a scofflaw the moment it stepped hoof onto a neighboring property or street governed by a different set of rules. It must have made cattle drives through developed areas a legal minefield, requiring guides who were not only skilled drovers but also amateur legal scholars. All right, boys, remember, we can cut through old man Fitzwilliam's back 40. But whatever you do, do not let Bessie step on the sidewalk in the next town. They've got a strict anti-bovine loitering ordinance. These laws also highlight the changing relationship between humans and animals. As towns grew into cities, the close proximity to livestock became less feasible and less desirable for many residents. The smell, the noise, the mess, these were things urban reformers and public health advocates sought to eliminate. Animal control laws were a key part of this effort to create cleaner, quieter, and more orderly urban environments, pushing working animals and livestock out of the public spaces and into more confined, regulated areas, or out of the city entirely. Even seemingly minor laws, like those about dog barking, reflect this desire for order and control. In a world without constant mechanical noise, animal sounds were much more prominent. Regulating them was a way to assert human dominance over the urban soundscape and ensure a certain level of peace and quiet, at least, peace from animal noise. The irony, of course, is that the very machines replacing the animals, automobiles, streetcars, would soon introduce their own forms of noise pollution, prompting entirely new sets of regulations later on. So, while today we might worry about leash laws or breed restrictions, our early 20th century counterparts were grappling with legislating against bathtub-dwelling donkeys and ensuring that cows didn't hold up traffic. These laws, strange as they seem, offer a tangible link to a time when the boundary between rural and urban was blurrier, when animals were still central to daily life in ways we can barely imagine, and when lawmakers were trying to impose a fragile sense of order on a world that felt constantly on the verge of being disrupted by everything from new technology to a neighbor's wandering goat. You've survived cars, spitting, and Sunday. Now, try not to get run over by a legally regulated cow. So, you've somehow managed to avoid being cited for excessive barking, yours or a stray dog's, dodged a legally questionable cow, and kept your Sunday leisure activities strictly within the bounds of the law. Feeling pretty savvy about navigating this strange legal landscape, aren't you? Good. Because now, as you wander through the bustling marketplace, past stalls selling everything from fresh produce to patent medicines, you encounter a different kind of legal hazard, the goods themselves. The early 20th century was a wild west for consumer products. Regulations were sparse, advertising was often wildly exaggerated, and snake oil wasn't just a metaphor. It was a literal product you could buy, promising to cure everything from baldness to consumption. Remember our old friend tuberculosis from the spitting section. This era saw laws emerge not just to control behavior, but to control commerce itself, specifically targeting goods and practices deemed deceptive or harmful. Imagine walking into an apothecary or a general store. Rows and rows of bottles and boxes line the shelves, promising miracle cures and instant improvements. Dr. Quackenbush's Universal Elixir cures coughs, colds, gout, and gloom. Or perhaps a device guaranteed to regrow hair overnight, or a tonic that makes you instantly stronger. Today, we have the FDA, FTC, and a host of regulations ensuring products are reasonably safe and that claims aren't outright lies. Back then, buyer beware was the primary rule. This lack of oversight led to rampant fraud, with unscrupulous manufacturers selling ineffective, sometimes even dangerous, products to a public eager for relief from ailments or eager for a quick fix to life's problems. This is where lawmakers stepped in, often spurred by muckraking journalists exposing the worst abuses and by genuine public health concerns. The federal level eventually saw landmark legislation like the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which aimed to prevent the adulteration and misbranding of food and drugs sold in interstate commerce. This was a major step, but it was federal. At the state and local levels, lawmakers were also busy trying to tackle specific instances of fraud and deception that affected their constituents directly. These local laws often targeted highly specific products or practices that were causing particular problems in their area. Mainstream historical fact time. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, along with the Meat Inspection Act passed the same year, were pivotal moments in the history of U.S. consumer protection. They were largely a response to public outcry fueled by exposés like Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, which detailed unsanitary conditions in the meatpacking industry, and investigative journalism that revealed the harmful ingredients and fraudulent claims of many patent medicines. While federal, this act set a precedent and spurred further state-level action against deceptive products. The local laws often felt like whack-a-mole. A new miracle cure would appear, gain popularity, and only after numerous complaints or injuries would a town or state legislature consider passing a law specifically targeting that product or type of product. This led to laws that sound incredibly specific today. For example, you might find a state law regulating the sale of electric belts, devices claiming to cure ailments with mild electric shocks, or banning the advertisement of treatments for specific diseases like tuberculosis, or venereal diseases, which were often exploited by quacks. It wasn't just about regulating ingredients. It was about regulating the claims being made, trying to rein in the most outlandish promises. Quirky tidbit: some laws targeted not just the product, but the method of sale or advertisement. Imagine a town ordinance banning street vendors from using loud bells or whistles to sell their wares, specifically because it was a common tactic for hawking dubious goods like invisible ink or instant stain removers. That didn't work. Or a law requiring that advertisements for certain health products include a specific warning label, or even list certain ingredients, a precursor to modern labeling laws, but applied haphazardly to whatever product caught the local lawmakers' ire. There are stories of towns banning specific types of fortune-telling or palm reading, viewing them less as harmless entertainment, and more as fraudulent practices preying on the gullible, often linked to the sale of accompanying Lucky Charms or potions. Trying to legislate against someone reading tea leaves feels like a particularly granular use of legal power. Excuse me, ma'am, I'm afraid predicting a tall, dark stranger is a violation of Ordinance 7B. The penalty is $5 or 3 nights in the stocks. Historians still argue whether these early consumer protection laws, both federal and local, were primarily driven by a genuine desire to protect the public from harm and fraud, or if they were also influenced by established businesses seeking to eliminate competition from less scrupulous operators, or even by moral crusaders targeting products associated with vice or superstition. It was likely a complex interplay, with public health advocates, ethical businesses, and social reformers all pushing for greater regulation, each with their own motivations. Consider the challenges of enforcing these laws. How do you prove a miracle cure is fraudulent? You need scientific evidence, which wasn't always readily available or accepted in court. You need inspectors to check products and advertisements, a costly undertaking for small municipalities. And manufacturers were often quick to adapt, slightly changing their ingredients or claims to skirt the letter of the law. It was a constant cat-and-mouse game between regulators and hucksters. These laws also highlight the vulnerability of the consumer in an era before mass communication and standardized information. People relied on word of mouth, often exaggerated advertising, and the persuasive skills of salesmen. When you were suffering from a chronic illness, the promise of a quick cure, no matter how outlandish, could be incredibly tempting. Lawmakers were trying, imperfectly, to create a layer of protection for citizens who were easily exploited. Think about the sheer variety of products being sold. From radium water, seriously, people drank this, believing radiation was good for them, to electric corsets, from weight loss pills containing dangerous chemicals to worthless gadgets promising to improve your life. The market was flooded with items that simply didn't do what they claimed, or worse, were actively harmful. Each of these could potentially trigger a specific local law if it became enough of a problem in that community. A town experiencing a rash of injuries from a particular type of ill-designed appliance might pass an ordinance regulating its sale. A community plagued by vendors selling fake gold might pass a law requiring specific markings on precious metals. These laws, though often forgotten, were the ancestors of our modern consumer protection framework. They represent the dawning realization that in a complex industrial economy, the government had a role to play in ensuring basic fairness and safety in the marketplace. They moved society slowly away from a pure, "let the buyer beware" philosophy towards one where manufacturers had some legal responsibility for the products they sold and the claims they made. So, as you stroll through the marketplace of 1910, admiring the horse-drawn carriages, hopefully legally parked, and trying not to spit, remember to be wary of the goods on offer. That bottle promising eternal youth might just be colored water, and that gadget guaranteed to solve all your problems might be illegal under an obscure local ordinance passed after old Mrs. Gable got swindled out of her pension. It was an era where regulating commerce meant getting down into the weeds of specific products and specific lies, leading to a fascinating, and sometimes baffling, collection of laws aimed at protecting citizens from the deceptive practices of the day. Just try not to buy any electric hair restorer. There was probably a law against that too. So, you've browsed the marketplace, perhaps resisting the urge to purchase that bottle of electric brain tonic. Good call. There was probably a local ordinance against selling it after old Mr. Henderson started glowing faintly. You step back out onto the street, clutching your lawful purchases, feeling reasonably confident. But the legal tightrope walk isn't over just because you're outside. In early 20th century America, public spaces weren't just thoroughfares. They were stages for potential infractions, places where your every action, sound, and even your mere presence could fall under the long shadow of the law. Lawmakers were obsessed with imposing order on the burgeoning chaos of urban life, and public behavior was ripe for regulation. Imagine the sounds of the street again, the clatter of hooves, the rumble of those early automobiles, moving at a legally mandated snail's pace, hopefully, the calls of vendors, the general hubbub. Amidst this cacophony, certain human noises could get you into trouble. While we touched on animal noise laws, people were also subject to regulations about how much noise they could make. Were you feeling cheerful and decided to sing a little tune as you walked? Be careful. Some towns had ordinances against loud or boisterous singing in public, especially at night. Did you get into a heated argument with a friend on the street corner? Disorderly conduct, which often included shouting or causing a public disturbance, was a catch-all offense that could land you in hot water. The definition of disorderly was, of course, highly subjective and often depended on the mood of the nearest police officer or the tolerance of your neighbors. It makes you wonder if humming quietly was okay, or if even that could be deemed excessively melodic by a particularly grumpy constable. Beyond noise, simply being in a public space could be legally fraught. Loitering laws, while not new, saw increased application as cities grew. Standing around on a street corner, seemingly doing nothing, could attract unwanted attention from the authorities. These laws were often vaguely worded, targeting vagrants or suspicious persons, which, in practice, could mean anyone who didn't look like they had legitimate business being there, or perhaps didn't fit the prevailing social norms of the community. Trying to just hang out, watch the world go by, or wait for a friend could potentially be interpreted as loitering, especially if you were young, poor, or a member of a minority group. It was a way for the authorities to clean up the streets, pushing undesirable elements out of public view, often under the guise of maintaining order. Mainstream historical fact time, the Progressive Era, roughly 1890s to 1920s, saw a significant focus on urban reform, including efforts to improve public spaces and control social behavior. As cities grew rapidly through industrialization and immigration, reformers and city officials sought to impose order and cleanliness on what they perceived as chaotic and potentially dangerous urban environments. Laws governing public conduct, from spitting, as we've seen, to noise and loitering, were part of this broader movement to create more orderly, predictable, and respectable urban life. The laws could also get incredibly specific, targeting actions that seem utterly harmless today. Were you tempted to sit on the steps of a public building to rest your weary feet? Check the local ordinance. Some places had rules against sitting or lounging on steps or sidewalks, presumably to keep pedestrian traffic flowing or to prevent people from appearing too comfortable in a public space, which might look like loitering. Did you spit out a piece of gum? Well, we've already covered the spitting laws, but some regulations might have specifically mentioned littering small items like gum wrappers or fruit peels. Every minor act in public had the potential to be legislated against, reflecting a desire for total control over the shared environment. Quirky tidbit: one particularly strange type of public behavior law targeted specific forms of public interaction or performance. While busking wasn't a widespread phenomenon as it is today, some towns had laws against public fortune-telling, or even specific types of street performance if they were deemed a nuisance or a form of begging. There's a reported, though hard to definitively source universally, type of ordinance from the era that banned whistling on certain streets after dark, possibly because it was seen as a signal for illicit activity, or perhaps just because a powerful local figure found whistling annoying. Imagine being fined for whistling a cheerful tune on your way home. That's 5 cents for Yankee Doodle, sir. And make it snappy. It highlights how local anxieties or pet peeves could translate into oddly specific laws. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation behind the proliferation of specific public behavior laws was a genuine concern for public safety and order in rapidly changing urban environments, or if they were primarily tools for social control, aimed at regulating the behavior of specific groups deemed undesirable, such as recent immigrants, the poor, or young people who gathered in public spaces. It was likely a complex mix, with different laws and different communities having varying motivations, but the effect was undeniably a greater level of scrutiny and potential legal peril for simply existing in public. Enforcement of these laws was often uneven and discretionary. A well-dressed citizen might be given a polite warning for a minor infraction, while someone perceived as a troublemaker might be immediately arrested for the same offense. This discretionary element made these laws powerful tools for social policing, allowing authorities to target individuals or groups based on appearance, perceived social status, or simply whether they were liked or disliked by the local power structure. It added another layer of uncertainty to navigating the public space. It wasn't just about knowing the rules, but also about who was watching and how they felt about you. Consider the sheer volume of potential rules. You couldn't spit, you couldn't sing too loudly, you couldn't shout, you couldn't sit on certain steps, you couldn't loiter, and maybe you couldn't even whistle after dark. Simply going for a walk required a level of self-awareness and restraint that feels foreign today. You had to be constantly mindful of the sounds you were making, where you were standing, and what you were doing, lest you inadvertently run afoul of a hyper-specific ordinance. It makes you appreciate the relative freedom of expression and casual lounging we have in most public spaces today. Though, to be fair, you still might get a ticket for littering or a noise complaint if you're really loud. Some concerns are timeless. These laws governing public behavior, though many are now forgotten or significantly altered, represent a crucial chapter in the development of urban life and law. They show a society grappling with the challenges of density, diversity, and change, attempting to legislate a shared sense of order and decorum. They highlight the tension between individual freedom and collective control, and the often arbitrary ways in which that tension played out in the specific ordinances of towns and cities across America. Walking down the street in 1910 wasn't just a physical journey, it was a legal performance, where every step and every sound could potentially be judged against the bewildering, hyper-specific code of public conduct. Just try not to whistle that catchy tune you heard earlier. It might be illegal. So, you've navigated the bustling, rule-bound streets, carefully avoided stepping on any legally sensitive surfaces, and managed to keep your public vocalizations to a legally permissible minimum. You're starting to get the hang of this. A simple walk through town is less about getting from point A to point B and more about performing a complex legal ballet. But the world of 1910 isn't just about physical movement and public presence. It's also about communication, and like everything else in this era, communication was starting to fall under the watchful, often peculiar, eye of the law. As technology advanced and public spaces became more crowded, how people sent messages, advertised their wares, or simply spoke to each other in public became subjects for regulation, leading to some truly strange rules about everything from telephones to signs. Imagine the marvel of the telephone. It wasn't in every home yet, but public phones, often in booths or in stores, were becoming more common. This magical device that let you speak across distances was revolutionary, but like the automobile, it was a new technology with no established legal framework. What were the rules for using it? Could you tie up a public line for hours? Could you use it to spread gossip or make threats? Lawmakers, grappling with the implications of instant, disembodied communication, started to create ordinances to manage this new phenomenon. Some early laws focused on preventing misuse, like making false calls or using abusive language over the wire. Others addressed the physical presence of telephone poles and wires, regulating where they could be placed, often in response to concerns about aesthetics or safety. Imagine tripping over a low-hanging telephone wire. There's probably a law about that too. Mainstream historical fact time. The Bell telephone system was rapidly expanding in the early 20th century. By 1910, there were millions of telephones in the United States, a dramatic increase from the late 19th century. This rapid adoption meant that towns and cities had to quickly figure out how to integrate this new network, leading to regulations about infrastructure, poles, wires, conduits, and public access or use of the service, often through local franchises or ordinances governing telephone companies operating within their limits. But communication wasn't just verbal. The visual landscape was also changing, dominated by signs. Billboards were popping up, store owners were hanging elaborate advertisements, and political posters plastered walls and fences. To some, this was vibrant commerce and free expression. To others, it was visual clutter, an assault on public aesthetics, and a potential source of distraction or even danger. Imagine a giant sign falling on you, another potential specific law origin story. Lawmakers, ever eager to impose order, began regulating signage. These weren't just simple zoning laws, which were themselves only beginning to emerge. They were often highly specific rules about the size, placement, and even the content of signs. Quirky tidbit: some towns had incredibly specific laws about what you couldn't put on a sign, beyond just false advertising, which might fall under those deceptive product laws we discussed. There are reports of ordinances banning signs with obscene or immoral content, which, in the puritanical streak of the era, could mean almost anything deemed slightly risque or even just politically controversial. More bizarrely, some laws reportedly regulated the materials signs could be made of, or banned specific types of signs like temporary banners or flashing lights, perhaps seen as particularly garish or distracting. Imagine getting a visit from the sign inspector because your advertisement for legally regulated ice cream was deemed excessively flashy, or made of the wrong type of legally prohibited wood. Sir, Ordinance 4G clearly states no signs shall contain more than 3 primary colors or depict any animal wearing clothing. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of specific laws regulating public communication, from telephone use to signage, was primarily driven by a genuine desire to manage the practical challenges of new technologies and urban growth, preventing nuisance calls, controlling visual clutter, or if they were also used as tools for social control, limiting certain types of expression, targeting specific businesses or political groups through restrictive advertising rules, or imposing a particular aesthetic vision on the public realm. It was likely a complex blend, with concerns about public order and safety mingling with attempts to shape the social and visual environment. Consider the challenges of enforcing these rules. How do you monitor telephone conversations for abusive language? It was practically impossible, leading to laws that were difficult to prosecute unless there was a direct complaint about a specific, egregious incident. Regulating signs was slightly easier, requiring inspectors to patrol the streets and measure billboards, but it still led to disputes over interpretation. Was that image obscene? Was that sign too large? These were subjective calls that could lead to legal battles, often reflecting underlying tensions between property rights, free speech, though the concept of commercial free speech was less developed, and the community's desire for a clean, orderly appearance. These laws also highlight the evolving definition of public space. In a world where more people were interacting in shared physical areas, streets, parks, public buildings, and shared virtual spaces, telephone lines, the boundaries of acceptable behavior and expression were being redrawn. Lawmakers were trying to extend their reach beyond just regulating physical actions to regulating words spoken over a wire or images displayed for public consumption. It was a step towards the more complex regulatory environment we have today, where communication of all forms is subject to numerous rules. Think about the sheer variety of ways communication was being regulated. It wasn't just about what you said, but how you said it, loudly in public, where you said it, on a public phone, and how you displayed messages on a sign? Every new method of reaching people seemed to trigger a legislative reaction aimed at preventing its perceived negative consequences. The telephone was a source of potential noise and misuse. Signs were a source of visual chaos and potential deception. Public announcements, like town criers, yes, some still existed, or were replaced by official notices, or even someone shouting news, might also have fallen under noise or public disturbance laws. It was a world where even sending a message, in whatever form, could be a legal minefield. So, as you continue your journey through 1910, be mindful not just of where you step and what you do, but also of how you communicate. That casual chat on a public phone might be overheard by a constable listening for illegal language. That small sign you want to put up for your business might violate a bizarre ordinance about acceptable colors or images. These laws, born from the anxieties and practical challenges of a rapidly changing world, offer a fascinating glimpse into the early attempts to control the flow of information and imagery in public spaces. They remind us that even something as fundamental as communication hasn't always been free from the peculiar, hyper-specific regulations of a long-forgotten era. Just try not to whistle your message. Remember that might be illegal too. So, you've managed to communicate discreetly, avoided offending anyone with your sign choices, and kept your public whistling strictly legal. You're navigating the sidewalks of 1910 with a newfound sense of cautious confidence. But there's another ever-present threat in this era, one that could turn that dusty boardwalk and those wooden buildings into an inferno in minutes: fire. Before modern building codes, widespread electricity, and well-equipped fire departments, fire was a terrifying, destructive force that could wipe out entire blocks, or even towns. The fear of fire was palpable, and like every other fear in this era, it quickly translated into a flurry of laws, many of them strangely specific, aimed at preventing the spark from becoming a catastrophe. Imagine a town built largely of wood, heated by coal or wood stoves, lit by gas lamps or kerosene lanterns, with industries that produced flammable waste, and streets often too narrow for fire engines, if they even had proper fire engines. Every chimney spark, every dropped match, every carelessly stored pile of rags soaked in oil was a potential disaster waiting to happen. Lawmakers weren't just thinking about grand conflagrations. They were worried about the everyday hazards, the small things that could ignite a blaze. And this granular focus led to some incredibly detailed regulations about everything from building materials to personal habits. Mainstream historical fact time: large, devastating urban fires were a recurring nightmare throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries in the United States. Cities like Chicago, 1871, Boston, 1872, and San Francisco, 1906, suffered catastrophic fires that killed hundreds and destroyed vast areas. These disasters highlighted the inadequate building practices, firefighting capabilities, and preventative measures of the time, spurring intense efforts at reform and leading to many of the fire prevention laws we're discussing. The memory of these major fires, and smaller, frequent blazes, kept the fear of fire at the forefront of municipal concerns. This constant threat meant that fire prevention wasn't just the job of a dedicated fire brigade. It was, legally speaking, everyone's responsibility. And the laws reflected this. You might find ordinances dictating what materials you could use to build your house or business, perhaps banning wooden roofs in certain areas or requiring fire-resistant siding. There would be strict rules about chimneys, how high they had to be, how often they needed cleaning, and what kind of spark arresters they needed. Forget about just hiring a chimney sweep when you felt like it. Some laws mandated regular inspections and cleaning, turning your cozy fireplace into a potential legal liability if not properly maintained. Imagine a fire inspector showing up just as you're settling in for a nice evening by the hearth, demanding to see your chimney's cleaning certification. "I'm sorry, sir, but Ordinance 12C requires annual creosote removal, and frankly, your chimney looks like it's seen better days, possibly several decades ago." Beyond structural regulations, laws targeted flammable materials. Storing large quantities of kerosene, gasoline, increasingly common with those automobiles, or even hay, remember the horses? Within city limits was often heavily regulated or outright banned unless specific safety measures were taken. You couldn't just pile oily rags wherever you pleased. Spontaneous combustion was a known risk, and lawmakers legislated against it, requiring proper disposal or storage of such materials. Did you have a barn or stable on your property? There were likely specific fire codes for those, perhaps requiring fire breaks or dictating how manure and bedding could be stored. Your humble backyard could be a legal minefield of fire hazards if you weren't careful. Quirky tidbit: some fire prevention laws got truly granular, targeting specific, seemingly minor behaviors. There are reports of ordinances banning the lighting of bonfires or brush piles within a certain distance of buildings without a permit, reasonable enough. But others reportedly banned flying kites made of paper or other flammable materials near power lines, or even just near buildings, fearing they might ignite and cause a fire. Even more bizarrely, some towns are said to have had laws regulating the use of fireworks, not just banning their sale or use by individuals, which was common, but specifying exactly what types were illegal or when they could be used, down to the hour. Trying to figure out if your specific brand of sparkler was legal on the 4th of July must have been a holiday headache. Is this an illuminating fountain or a shower of sparks? The ordinance is very particular. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of highly specific fire prevention laws was primarily driven by a genuine, urgent need to reduce the devastating frequency of fires in a combustible era, or if they were also influenced by emerging industries, like brick manufacturers or cement companies, pushing for regulations that favored their products, or by insurance companies lobbying for measures that would reduce their payouts. It was likely a complex mix, with public safety concerns providing the main impetus, but economic interests and the simple human desire to do something in the face of a terrifying threat also playing significant roles. Enforcement of these laws was, again, a mixed bag. Building codes could be checked by inspectors, but monitoring every backyard pile of rags or every chimney flue was a monumental task. Neighbors likely played a significant role, reporting violations to the authorities, turning fire prevention into a form of community surveillance. Imagine the tension. Was your neighbor eyeing your woodpile with suspicion, wondering if it violated Ordinance 9b Section 3 subsection A? It added a layer of anxiety to everyday life. These laws also highlight the technological transition of the era. As electricity became more common, new fire hazards emerged, faulty wiring, prompting new regulations. The shift from horse-drawn vehicles to automobiles meant fire departments needed new equipment and strategies. The laws had to constantly adapt to new technologies and new risks, often lagging behind the actual changes on the ground. Think about the simple act of smoking. While less regulated than today, dropping a lit cigarette or pipe ash could easily start a fire. Some early fire laws might have included prohibitions against smoking in certain areas, like near stables or lumber yards, or even general rules about properly extinguishing smoking materials. It wasn't just about personal health, it was about public safety from fire. These bizarrely specific fire laws, from chimney height regulations to rules about kite materials, offer a glimpse into a society acutely aware of its vulnerability to fire and desperately trying to legislate safety through meticulous detail. They show a world where the threat was so constant that even minor actions were scrutinized for their potential to ignite disaster. It makes you appreciate modern fireproofing and building codes, even if you still grumble about smoke detector battery checks. At least you probably don't need a permit to light a match in your own home. Unless there's a forgotten ordinance about that somewhere. Just try not to store too much hay in your living room. There's definitely a law against that. So, you've successfully navigated the urban jungle of 1910, avoiding the legal perils of automobiles, spitting, Sunday leisure, noisy dogs, deceptive products, public whistling, offensive signs, and even illegal kite flying near potential fire hazards. You might think escaping the city limits means escaping the hyper-specific legal scrutiny. But venture out into the surrounding countryside, where farms still dominated the landscape, and you'd find that even the seemingly simple act of growing food or raising animals was subject to its own peculiar set of regulations. Life on the farm in early 20th century America wasn't just about sunup to sundown labor. It was also about navigating a forgotten legal framework governing everything from fence heights to pest control. Imagine the scene: you're on a farm just outside of town. The air smells of fresh turned earth, hay, and, well, manure. No spitting laws out here, maybe? You see fields of crops, perhaps a barn, some livestock grazing. It seems idyllic, free from the constraints of city ordinances. Yet, the rhythm of agricultural life, too, was increasingly being shaped by law, often in ways that reflected the changing relationship between rural and urban areas, concerns about property rights, and early attempts at standardizing farming practices. While farming might seem like a realm of individual autonomy, interactions with neighbors, the need for shared infrastructure, like irrigation ditches or fences, and concerns about pests or diseases spreading across property lines naturally led to regulations. And in the early 1900s, these regulations could get surprisingly detailed, reflecting local conditions and specific problems. Mainstream historical fact time. The early 20th century was a period of significant change in American agriculture, with increasing mechanization, scientific advancements, like new fertilizers and pest control methods, and a growing focus on commercial production for wider markets. This transition from largely subsistence farming to more integrated, commercial agriculture created new legal challenges related to land use, contracts, transportation of goods, and the spread of crop or animal diseases, prompting state and local governments to enact new laws. Consider something as basic as fences. In many areas, laws dictated not just whether you needed a fence, those stock laws we mentioned earlier, which required farmers to fence in their animals, but also what kind of fence it had to be. Laws might specify the minimum height of a lawful fence, the materials that could be used, or even how posts had to be spaced. This wasn't just about keeping animals in or out. It was about establishing clear property boundaries and preventing disputes between neighbors over wandering livestock or damaged crops. Imagine having to rebuild your perfectly functional fence because it was 2 inches shorter than the legally mandated height. Sorry, Farmer Giles, looks like you're in violation of the Picket Fence Act of 1907. That cow could potentially lean over and nibble Mrs. Higgins' prize-winning dahlias, and we can't have that. Beyond fences, laws targeted specific agricultural practices or problems. With the rise of commercial farming, pests and plant diseases became a bigger concern, as they could quickly spread and devastate crops destined for market. This led to early laws requiring farmers to take steps to control certain pests or diseases on their property. Imagine a law mandating that you had to destroy any plants showing signs of a specific blight, or face a fine. It was an early form of agricultural zoning and disease control, attempting to protect the collective output of a farming community by regulating individual practices. Quirky tidbit: some laws targeted specific crops or products in bizarre ways. There are reports of local ordinances banning the cultivation of certain plants deemed undesirable, perhaps because they were invasive, attracted specific pests, or were simply seen as aesthetically displeasing by powerful local landowners. Even more strangely, some historical accounts mention regulations related to the sale of specific farm products that went beyond basic weight or measure standards. For instance, a town might have had a law specifying how eggs had to be packaged, or banning the sale of milk unless the cow had been inspected within a certain time frame, reflecting early, piecemeal attempts at food safety regulation before national standards were widespread. Trying to sell your eggs downtown, and being told they were in the wrong size carton must have been frustrating. But they're fresh! And legally laid. Doesn't matter, sir. Ordinance 14D requires all eggs to be sold in cartons of precisely 1 dozen, arranged with the small end up. Yours are chaotic. Historians still argue whether the increasing legal regulation of farming practices in the early 20th century was primarily driven by a genuine desire to improve agricultural efficiency, protect property rights, and control the spread of pests and diseases for the common good, or if it was also influenced by larger commercial farming interests seeking to standardize practices and potentially disadvantage smaller farmers who couldn't afford to comply with new regulations. It was likely a complex interplay, with reformers pushing for science-based farming methods encoded in law, while economic forces shaped which practices were deemed desirable or necessary. Enforcement of these farming laws could be tricky. Who was checking the height of every fence? Who was inspecting every field for signs of blight? Like city ordinances, enforcement often relied on neighborly complaints or periodic visits from county officials or agricultural inspectors, a profession that was also developing during this era. This could lead to neighborly disputes escalating into legal battles over boundary lines, shared water resources, or whether someone's chickens were legally confined. These laws also highlight the tension between traditional, often informal, farming practices and the push towards standardization and scientific agriculture. Many farmers had generations of knowledge passed down, but the new laws often reflected the latest agricultural science or the demands of a market economy, sometimes clashing with established ways of doing things. A law mandating a specific type of fertilizer or pest control method might have been met with skepticism or resistance from farmers used to different techniques. Think about water rights, a perennial source of conflict in agricultural areas, especially in drier regions. Early 20th century laws governing irrigation ditches, stream usage, and water allocation were crucial, and often incredibly complex and specific to the local geography and history of water use. A law determining who got access to water on which days, or how much water could be diverted from a particular stream, could make or break a farm, leading to intense legal battles over this vital resource. It makes modern water restrictions seem simple by comparison. Even seemingly minor things like the disposal of crop waste or the management of animal manure could fall under the purview of local laws, particularly if they were seen as potential sources of disease or pollution affecting neighbors or nearby towns. A law about where you could pile your compost, or how often you had to clean out your stables, might seem trivial, but in a densely populated rural area, it could be a genuine concern. These forgotten farming laws, from fence dimensions to mandated pest control, offer a unique window into the challenges and transformations of American agriculture in the early 20th century. They show a world where even cultivating the land was becoming subject to the increasing desire for order, standardization, and legal control that characterized the era. They remind us that the long arm of the law reached far beyond the city limits, extending into fields and farmyards, regulating the relationship between humans, animals, and the land in ways that seem strange and specific today, but were born from the very real needs and conflicts of the time. So, next time you see a fence, remember, it might not just be there to keep the cows in. It might be a silent monument to a long-forgotten legal battle over property rights and bovine boundaries. Leaving the fields behind, perhaps having successfully demonstrated that your fence met the legally mandated height requirements, and that your prize-winning pumpkins weren't harboring any legally prohibited blights, you head back towards the town. You might think the dense thicket of regulations thins out once you're off the farm and back onto the public thoroughfare, especially if you're not driving one of those noisy, legally precarious automobiles. But don't get comfortable just yet. The streets of early 20th century America were a complex ecosystem of movement: horses, wagons, streetcars, bicycles, and yes, pedestrians. And each of these modes of transport, and the people using them, were subject to their own set of rules, many of them specific, frustrating, and now largely forgotten. Imagine stepping back onto that dusty boardwalk. The concept of the street as primarily a space for cars didn't exist yet. Streets were shared spaces, used by everyone and everything. Pedestrians walked in the street, vendors set up stalls, children played, horses ambled, and early automobiles sputtered alongside streetcars clanging down rails. In this environment, simply walking wasn't entirely unregulated. While the idea of jaywalking, crossing the street illegally, wouldn't really gain legal traction until the automobile became dominant and streets were reprioritized for cars, there were still rules about pedestrians. You might find ordinances against obstructing the sidewalk, loitering, as we've seen, or perhaps even rules about where pedestrians could cross in relation to streetcar tracks to avoid accidents. It wasn't about protecting pedestrians from cars. Initially, it was often about keeping pedestrians from hindering the flow of horse-drawn traffic or streetcars, or simply maintaining a semblance of order. Trying to cross a busy intersection in 1910 wasn't just physically hazardous. It could be legally ambiguous. Then there were bicycles. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were the height of the bicycle craze before cars took over. Bicycles were revolutionary, fast, relatively affordable, and offering unprecedented personal mobility. And naturally, anything that moved faster than a walk and shared public space needed rules. Bicycle laws popped up everywhere, often treating cyclists more like vehicle operators than pedestrians. You might find speed limits specifically for bicycles, often surprisingly low in built-up areas. Laws might require bikes to have a bell or horn to warn others of their approach, and lights or reflectors for riding after dark. Some places even required bicycles to be registered and display a license plate, just like those early automobiles. Imagine having a tiny license plate on your handlebars, subject to inspection by the local constable. "Hold it right there, Sonny! Is that license plate properly affixed? And is that bell audible from 50 feet, as per Ordinance 22A?" It adds a whole new layer to a leisurely bike ride. Mainstream historical fact time. The peak of the first American bicycle boom was in the 1890s, but bicycles remained a popular and significant mode of transportation for many people well into the early 20th century, especially for commuting and errands before cars became widely accessible. Their speed relative to pedestrian or horse-drawn traffic, and their increasing numbers, necessitated specific regulations to manage their integration into the existing street environment, making bicycle laws a common feature of municipal codes. Streetcars were another major player in urban transport, and they came with their own legal baggage. Operating a streetcar was a regulated job, with laws governing routes, schedules, and safety procedures. For passengers, there were rules about boarding and exiting, often requiring you to wait until the car stopped completely, though this wasn't always followed. Behavior on board, no spitting on the floor, remember? And paying your fare. But there might also be more specific, localized rules. Perhaps an ordinance banning passengers from talking to the motorman while the car was in motion, a distraction risk. Or a law requiring passengers to signal exactly where they wanted to get off. Imagine missing your stop because you didn't perform the legally required arm gesture correctly. It sounds absurd, but in an era of hyper-specific rules, even signaling your stop wasn't immune from legislative attention. Quirky tidbit: some towns had laws regulating other, less common forms of street transport or activity. There are reports of ordinances specifically addressing roller skating on sidewalks or streets, sometimes banning it outright or restricting it to certain areas or times. Even handcarts or pushcarts used by vendors or laborers might have had specific regulations about their size, weight, or where they could be operated, perhaps to prevent congestion or damage to the street surface. One particularly odd report, again, hard to verify universally, mentions a town having a law against using stilts on public streets, presumably deemed a nuisance or a safety hazard. So, if you were planning to get around town on stilts in 1910, you might have needed a permit, or faced a fine for illegal elevation. It makes you wonder about the specific incident that led to that law being passed. Was there a rogue stilt walker causing chaos? A stilt-related accident involving a legally regulated cow? The possibilities are endless and baffling. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of specific laws governing non-car transportation in the early 20th century was primarily driven by a genuine desire to improve public safety and manage the complex interactions of different modes of transport in crowded urban spaces, or if they were also influenced by a desire to privilege certain types of traffic, like streetcars or eventually automobiles, over others, like pedestrians or cyclists, or even to control who used public spaces and how they used them. It was likely a complex mix, with safety concerns providing a rational basis, but underlying social and economic factors shaping the specific regulations and their enforcement. Enforcement of these laws varied widely. A constable might turn a blind eye to a child roller skating illegally but strictly enforce the rules about bicycle lights after dark. Pedestrian laws were probably the hardest to enforce consistently unless they involved a clear obstruction or accident. Streetcar laws were likely enforced by the company itself, or by police called in for more serious disturbances. This inconsistency meant that navigating the streets legally wasn't just about knowing the rules, but about understanding local customs and the likelihood of enforcement. These laws also highlight the transitional nature of the era. The streets were changing rapidly. The dominance of the horse was fading, the bicycle had its moment, the streetcar was king in many cities, and the automobile was the rapidly rising challenger. Lawmakers were trying to manage this chaotic transition, often applying old ways of thinking, like requiring licenses for vehicles, whether motorized or pedal-powered, to new problems, or creating entirely new rules based on the specific characteristics of each mode of transport. It was a period of legal experimentation on the fly, played out on the asphalt and cobblestones of America's towns and cities. Think about the cumulative effect of all these rules. You couldn't spit, you couldn't sing too loudly, you couldn't loiter, you had to be careful where you crossed the street, your bicycle needed a bell and possibly a license plate, and you had to signal correctly to get off the streetcar. Simply moving through public space required constant awareness of a myriad of specific, often localized, regulations. It makes a modern walk or bike ride feel incredibly free by comparison. Though you might still get a ticket for running a red light on your bike, some traffic concerns, and the desire to regulate movement, persist across the centuries. Just be glad you probably don't need a license plate for your roller skates. Unless you're planning a trip to that one specific town. So, you've successfully traversed the streets, navigating the legal complexities of walking, biking, streetcar riding, and hopefully not attempting to roller skate or use stilts in a legally prohibited zone. You've avoided fines for spitting, noisy dogs, and excessive public cheerfulness. You might think that if you just found a quiet corner and did something mundane, you'd be safe. But even the act of earning a living, particularly in some of the more unusual or niche professions of the era, could bring you face to face with a set of incredibly specific, now forgotten laws. As the economy diversified and cities grew, new jobs emerged, and lawmakers, ever vigilant for potential nuisances or opportunities for regulation, were quick to impose rules, often for reasons that seem baffling today. Imagine the sheer variety of ways people earned a living in 1910 that are less common now. Organ grinders with their monkeys, street performers, traveling tinkers, specific types of peddlers selling very particular wares, even people performing services like sharpening knives on the street corner. These were the colorful, sometimes noisy, characters of the urban landscape, and their presence, their methods, and their very right to operate were increasingly being questioned and regulated. While major professions like doctors, lawyers, or merchants had established licensing or regulatory bodies, these smaller, more transient, or less conventional jobs often fell into a legal gray area. Were they providing a valuable service, or were they just public nuisances, beggars, or even fronts for illicit activities? Local lawmakers, reflecting the anxieties and prejudices of their communities, often leaned towards the latter, leading to ordinances that targeted specific jobs with surprising detail. Mainstream historical fact time. As cities industrialized and populations grew, the traditional, informal economy of traveling vendors, street performers, and various niche service providers came into conflict with the emerging desire for urban order, sanitation, and formal business structures. Municipal governments increasingly sought to control who could operate in public spaces, where they could do so, and under what conditions, often through licensing requirements, permits, or outright bans on certain activities, ostensibly for reasons of public safety, hygiene, or maintaining a respectable appearance. Take, for instance, the humble organ grinder. A seemingly harmless purveyor of street music, perhaps accompanied by a small, costumed monkey collecting coins. What could be illegal about that? Well, in some towns, quite a lot. Ordinances might ban street music entirely, or require a prohibitively expensive license, effectively banning organ grinders who couldn't afford it. Others might have specific rules about when or where street music could be played, perhaps forbidding it near churches or schools, or after a certain hour. And the monkey? Some places had laws about keeping exotic animals, or even specific rules about animals being used for commercial purposes in public, turning the organ grinder's furry assistant into a potential legal liability. Imagine explaining to a judge why your monkey was in violation of the Public Primate Performance Prohibition Act of 1911. But Your Honor, he just wants to dance for pennies. He's not hurting anyone. Quirky tidbit. One particularly strange type of regulation reportedly targeted specific types of street vendors based on what they were selling or how they were selling it. For example, some towns are said to have had laws requiring ice cream vendors to keep their carts moving at all times, presumably to prevent them from blocking pedestrian traffic or setting up permanent feeding stalls without paying for a business license. Others might have had specific rules about the noise level of vendor calls or bells, a callback to those communication and public behavior laws, or even banned the sale of specific low-value items on the street, viewing it as a form of begging. There's a story, possibly apocryphal but widely circulated, about a town that had a law banning the sale of headless dolls, perhaps related to moral panic or sanitation fears, but specifically targeting that bizarrely niche product. It makes you wonder if selling dolls with heads was perfectly legal, but removing the heads suddenly made them contraband. Officer, I swear, the heads just fell off naturally. It wasn't intentional decapitation for commercial gain. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation behind the proliferation of specific laws targeting niche and unusual professions was a genuine desire to protect the public from fraud or nuisance, or if it was more about social control, marginalizing certain groups. Many street vendors or performers were immigrants, and pushing informal economic activities out of public view to create a more orderly and sanitized urban environment favored by rising middle classes and established businesses. It was likely a complex interplay, with concerns about public health and safety mingling with economic protectionism and attempts to enforce a particular vision of urban respectability. Enforcement of these laws could be highly discretionary. A friendly constable might look the other way for a regular organ grinder who caused no trouble, while a newcomer or someone perceived as disruptive might quickly face fines or arrest. This uneven enforcement meant that the legality of your niche profession often depended less on the letter of the law and more on your relationship with the local authorities and community. It added a layer of precariousness to these already often marginalized ways of making a living. Think about the sheer administrative burden these laws created. Licensing boards or permits for every type of peddler, every street musician, every knife sharpener? It required a bureaucracy to manage, inspect, and enforce rules for jobs that might only provide a meager income. It feels like an incredible amount of effort directed at regulating the very fringes of the economy. But for lawmakers in this era, no corner of public life, no matter how small or unusual, seemed too insignificant to escape the impulse to legislate. These laws also highlight the changing nature of work and public space. As cities became more formalized and commercialized, the spontaneous, often chaotic, energy of street life was increasingly seen as something to be managed and controlled. The street was becoming a place for efficient transport and formal business, not a stage for impromptu performances or a marketplace for every conceivable item, no matter how strange. The laws governing niche professions were part of this larger transition, attempting to impose order and predictability on the vibrant, messy reality of urban economic life. From regulating the movements of ice cream carts to potentially banning headless dolls, the specific laws targeting unusual and niche jobs in early 20th century America offer a fascinating glimpse into a society grappling with economic change, urban growth, and the perennial question of who belongs in public spaces and what they are allowed to do there. They remind us that the long arm of the law reached into the most unexpected corners of daily life, turning even the simplest or strangest ways of earning a living into a potential legal challenge. Just try not to play that accordion too loudly, or let your monkey wear a hat that violates the local dress code ordinance we might encounter later. There's probably a law against that too. So, you've managed to make your way through the urban landscape, potentially dodging legally dubious street vendors and definitely not attempting any outlaw stilt walking. You've navigated the rules of transit, conversation, and even fire prevention. But life isn't just about work and getting around. It's also about leisure, about having fun, about playing. And wouldn't you know it, in the hyper-regulated world of early 20th century America, even playtime wasn't immune to the long arm of the law. As cities grew and new forms of entertainment emerged, lawmakers, ever concerned with public order, morality, and safety, felt compelled to impose rules on how people could amuse themselves, leading to some truly strange and specific regulations governing games, sports, and public entertainment. Imagine a hot summer afternoon. Kids are playing stickball in the street, carefully avoiding those legally regulated automobiles and streetcars, one hopes. Adults might be gathered in a park for a game of cards or dice, or perhaps heading to a local ballpark for a baseball game. In the evening, maybe a trip to the theater or increasingly, the Nickelodeon to watch those flickering moving pictures. All of these activities, seemingly simple forms of recreation, could potentially bring you into conflict with the law, depending on where you were and what specific ordinance was on the books. The primary drivers for regulating play and entertainment often fell into a few categories: preventing gambling, maintaining public order, noise, crowds, enforcing public morality, censorship, perceived vice, and ensuring safety. And the laws enacted to achieve these goals could be incredibly detailed and specific, targeting particular games, specific venues, or even certain types of performances. Mainstream historical fact time. The early 20th century saw the rise of organized sports as a major form of entertainment and leisure. Baseball, in particular, became widely popular, with professional leagues drawing large crowds. At the same time, new forms of commercial entertainment like vaudeville theaters, amusement parks, and early motion picture shows, Nickelodeons, exploded in popularity, transforming how people spent their free time and creating new public spaces that lawmakers felt needed to be controlled and regulated. Gambling was a major concern, and laws against it were common. But beyond outright bans on operating gambling houses, some specific laws targeted games themselves if they were associated with betting. Playing cards or dice in public, even for small stakes, could be illegal under local ordinances designed to crack down on casual gambling. Imagine trying to enjoy a friendly game of poker in the park only to be busted by a constable who deemed your penny ante game a violation of the Public Gaming Prohibition Act of 1908. All right, gentlemen, hands where I can see 'em. Is that a full house? Looks like you're playing for keeps, and that's illegal. It feels like an overreach for a casual game, but the association with gambling made many games suspect in the eyes of the law. Sports weren't immune either. While organized baseball might have been tolerated or even encouraged, less formal sports or games played in public spaces could run into trouble. Playing noisy games in residential areas might violate those public disturbance or noise ordinances we discussed earlier. Some towns might have had specific rules about which parks could be used for sports, or what types of sports were allowed, perhaps banning rougher games deemed dangerous or disruptive. Even something as simple as playing catch in the street could potentially be a legal gray area, depending on local traffic and loitering laws. Trying to play a pickup game of baseball and having it shut down because your makeshift bases were deemed illegal street obstructions would definitely take the fun out of it. Quirky tidbit: some laws went beyond just banning gambling or noisy sports and targeted specific forms of entertainment, or even specific items used in games. There are reports of towns having ordinances banning the sale or use of slingshots within city limits, presumably because they were seen as a menace or a tool for vandalism, but effectively outlawing a common childhood toy. Even more bizarrely, some historical accounts mention laws regulating or banning specific types of public performances deemed immoral or indecent, which could include everything from racy vaudeville acts to specific dance styles. And in the early days of cinema, before national censorship boards were established, some cities and states had their own film censorship boards or ordinances, leading to a patchwork of rules about what could be shown on screen. A movie perfectly legal in one town might be banned a few miles away because it showed excessive ankle exposure, or depicted a handshake deemed too familiar. Trying to program a film reel that satisfied the moral standards of every town on the circuit must have been a logistical and legal nightmare. Okay, the scene where he tips his hat is fine for Ohio, but we need to cut the part where she smiles directly at him for the Pennsylvania run, per the public display of unnecessary amiability ordinance. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of specific laws regulating play and entertainment was primarily driven by a genuine concern for public safety, order, and morality in rapidly changing urban environments, or if they were also used as tools for social control, aimed at suppressing activities associated with working class or immigrant communities, or protecting established entertainment forms from new competitors like cinema or amusement parks. It was likely a complex mix, with reformers pushing for moral uplift and order, while economic interests and social prejudices also played significant roles in shaping which forms of play were deemed acceptable or required legal restraint. Enforcement of these laws was often inconsistent. Minor infractions, like a quiet game of cards, might be ignored, while noisier or more visible activities were more likely to draw attention. Laws targeting specific forms of entertainment could be influenced by local lobbying efforts. Theater owners might push for restrictions on rowdy dance halls, for example. The discretionary nature of enforcement meant that simply knowing the law wasn't enough. You also had to gauge the prevailing mood and the likelihood of a complaint from a neighbor or a visit from a busybody constable. These laws also highlight the tension between the desire for individual freedom and the community's attempt to impose collective standards of behavior and taste. What one person saw as harmless fun, another might view as a public nuisance or a moral threat. Lawmakers were caught in the middle, trying to balance these competing interests, often through clumsy, overly specific regulations that felt heavy-handed even at the time. Think about the growth of amusement parks. These new centers of leisure offered thrilling rides and attractions, but they also presented new safety concerns. Early regulations for amusement parks often focused on structural integrity of rides, fire safety, remember those laws? And preventing overcrowding, reflecting a genuine concern for public safety in these novel environments. But even here, local morality laws could creep in, perhaps dictating dress codes for patrons or banning certain types of games or performances within the park grounds. The sheer variety of activities targeted by these laws, from card games to roller skating to film content, shows just how deeply the impulse to regulate permeated daily life in this era. No aspect of public, or even semi-public activity seemed too trivial to escape the possibility of a specific legal restriction. It makes you appreciate the relative freedom we have today in choosing how to spend our leisure time, even if modern regulations still exist regarding things like noise levels, public intoxication, or safety standards for entertainment venues. At least you can probably enjoy a game of cards in the park without worrying about getting arrested, unless you're playing for truly ridiculous stakes. Just be sure not to bring your slingshot. That might still be illegal in some places. So, you've carefully navigated the legal minefield of public spaces, avoiding fines for everything from excessive spitting to illegal stilt walking, and perhaps even managing a game of legally sanctioned checkers in the park. You've learned that nearly every action, every sound, and every movement could bring you into conflict with the bewildering laws of early 20th century America. But even after you've finished your legally permitted activities for the day, and you're simply presenting yourself in public, you're not entirely safe. Because this was an era where even the way you dressed, and your personal appearance, could fall under the scrutiny of the law, leading to some truly strange and specific regulations about clothing and grooming. Imagine walking down that street again. Today, you likely give little thought to what you're wearing, beyond comfort or style. But in 1910, your attire could be a legal liability. The motivations for regulating dress and appearance were varied, maintaining public morality and decency, ensuring public health and sanitation, controlling social behavior, and sometimes, simply enforcing a particular vision of respectability. And these motivations translated into ordinances that dictated not just what you couldn't wear, but sometimes even what you had to wear, depending on the situation. Public decency laws were, of course, the most obvious category. While outright public nudity was universally illegal, the definition of indecent clothing could vary wildly and become incredibly specific, particularly as social norms around dress began to change, especially for women. As more people frequented public beaches or swimming holes, laws emerged regulating bathing attire. These weren't just suggestions, they were often legally enforced dress codes for swimming. Imagine a law specifying the minimum amount of fabric required for a bathing suit, or mandating that men had to wear tops as well as bottoms. There are famous stories, often cited as quirky tidbits, about beach patrols in some places literally measuring the distance from a woman's knee to the hem of her bathing suit skirt, ready to issue a citation if it was deemed too short. A few inches of exposed leg could turn a pleasant dip in the ocean into a legal kerfuffle. "I'm sorry, madam, but your hemline is in clear violation of the Seaside Sartorial Statute of 1912. That's $5 or a mandatory addition of lace trim." It sounds like something out of a cartoon, but the anxiety about changing modesty standards was very real and sometimes codified into law. Mainstream historical fact time. As public recreational spaces like beaches and parks became more popular and accessible in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, municipal governments often enacted strict regulations regarding appropriate attire in these spaces. These decency laws were intended to enforce prevailing moral standards and often targeted women's clothing as it became less restrictive than Victorian norms, reflecting a societal unease with changing gender roles and public presentation. Beyond beaches, other public spaces could have implicit or explicit dress codes enforced by law or by proprietors under threat of legal action, like being asked to leave for disorderly conduct if your clothing was deemed inappropriate. While less common as specific ordinances, societal pressure and the risk of being stopped by police for looking suspicious based on your attire also acted as a form of regulation, particularly for marginalized groups whose clothing might not conform to dominant norms. Loitering laws, as we touched on earlier, could easily be applied based on appearance. Specific professions could also have legally mandated attire or hygiene standards that affected appearance. While not always about fashion, laws requiring vendors handling food to maintain a certain level of cleanliness, or laws requiring specific uniforms or badges for certain public roles, like streetcar conductors or police officers, implicitly regulated appearance for functional or identification purposes. Less common, but not unheard of, were local rules about the appearance of street performers or peddlers, sometimes banning certain costumes or forms of dress deemed misleading or offensive. Quirky tidbit: one of the stranger types of appearance laws reportedly targeted specific items of clothing or accessories deemed problematic. There are accounts of local ordinances banning the wearing of masks in public outside of specific holidays like Halloween, presumably for reasons of identification and preventing crime, but also perhaps reflecting a general suspicion of anonymity. Even more bizarrely, some historical anecdotes mention laws banning the wearing of hats that obstructed the view in theaters or public gatherings, a seemingly polite request enforced with the weight of law. Imagine being told your elaborate bonnet was a legal nuisance. "Excuse me, ma'am, I'm afraid your millinery is in violation of the Public Vista Protection Ordinance. It must be removed or you must relocate to the legally approved unobstructed view section." It highlights how even minor social frictions could escalate into legal regulations in this era. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of specific laws regulating dress and appearance was primarily driven by a genuine desire to uphold public morality and sanitation, or if they were also used as tools for social control, aimed at enforcing class distinctions, policing gender expression, or discriminating against immigrant groups whose traditional clothing might differ from mainstream American styles. It was likely a complex interplay, with moral reformers, public health advocates, and those seeking to maintain social hierarchies all contributing to the pressure for such regulations. Enforcement of these laws was, as with many others, often subjective and inconsistent. A police officer's personal interpretation of indecent or suspicious could be the deciding factor. Beach patrols might crack down one day and ignore violations the next. Laws targeting specific items like hats or masks were likely enforced only when they caused a direct problem or annoyance. This discretionary enforcement meant that simply knowing the letter of the law wasn't enough. You also had to consider the potential for a busybody neighbor or a particularly strict constable to take issue with your appearance. These laws also highlight the tension between individual self-expression and the community's desire for conformity and order. In an era of rapid social change, particularly regarding women's roles and public visibility, clothing became a battleground for competing ideas about morality and appropriate behavior. Lawmakers, often reflecting the more conservative elements of society, attempted to use legislation to slow down or control these changes, resulting in laws that seem incredibly restrictive and peculiar today. Think about the cumulative effect. You had to be careful what you said, where you stood, how you moved, and even how you looked. Your clothing, your hairstyle, though less commonly regulated than clothing, your general presentation, all could potentially bring you under legal scrutiny. It makes getting dressed in the morning feel like preparing for a legal inspection. Were your sleeves the right length? Was your hat too big? Were your shoes too dirty? It adds a whole new layer of stress to picking out an outfit. These forgotten laws regulating dress and appearance, from bathing suit measurements to bans on specific hats, offer a fascinating glimpse into a society grappling with changing social norms, public morality, and the desire to impose order on a rapidly diversifying and modernizing population. They show how deeply the impulse to legislate permeated daily life, reaching into the seemingly private realm of personal presentation, turning even the simple act of getting dressed into a potential encounter with the peculiar, hyper-specific legal codes of a long-gone era. Just try not to wear that mask outside of Halloween, or you might find yourself explaining your fashion choices to a judge. So, you've made it this far, navigating the early 20th century legal landscape with impressive, and probably historically inaccurate, grace. You've avoided fines for illegal spitting, excessive whistling, and perhaps even a citation for your slightly too short bathing suit hemline. You've steered clear of unlicensed organ grinders and potentially outlawed headless dolls. You might think we've plumbed the depths of strange, specific, now forgotten laws. But before we leave this peculiar era behind and ease into the modern night, there's one final category to explore, the truly bizarre. The laws that make you scratch your head and wonder, what on earth happened to make someone think that needed a law? These are the regulations born from hyperlocal anxieties, one-off incidents, or simply the boundless creativity of lawmakers with too much time on their hands. Imagine a town council meeting in 1910. They've dealt with the pressing issues, paving the streets, hiring a new constable, debating the merits of the new anti-spitting campaign. Now, someone raises a hand and says, "You know, I've been thinking. We need a law about," and fills in the blank with something utterly nonsensical by today's standards. These are the rules that often get cited as quirky state laws. Today, even if many are apocryphal or misinterpreted fragments of much older, sometimes more practical, at the time, ordinances. But even the real ones that existed offer a window into specific, fleeting moments of legislative panic or local oddity. Take, for example, laws related to specific foods or dining practices. While many regulations around food were about sanitation, remember those early, piecemeal food safety rules, some went beyond that. There are reports of towns having laws banning specific foods from being eaten in certain places, or regulating how you could eat them. One oft-cited, though possibly mythical, example is a law banning the eating of ice cream cones on Sundays in certain parts of the country. The alleged reasoning varied. Perhaps it was seen as too frivolous for the Sabbath, or maybe it was related to health concerns if vendors weren't clean. Regardless of the true origin, if it even existed beyond local lore, the idea of regulating something as simple as eating an ice cream cone highlights the granular level of control lawmakers sometimes sought. Imagine being stopped by a constable while enjoying a double scoop because it's Sunday. "Excuse me, sir, is that frozen dairy in a conical pastry? On the Lord's Day? You're coming with me." It's almost too absurd to be true, but it perfectly captures the spirit of hyper-specific regulation. Mainstream historical fact time. While many weird laws cited today are urban legends or distortions. The early 20th century was characterized by a high degree of local legislative autonomy and a rapid response to perceived problems, leading to a patchwork of unique ordinances. The push for progressive-era reforms, combined with local control, meant that town councils and state legislatures were actively creating laws for highly specific situations, often without the benefit of widespread communication or standardized legal frameworks seen today, making truly unusual laws more likely to emerge and persist, at least for a time. Beyond food, laws targeting specific, random objects or actions were common. We've mentioned slingshots and maybe even headless dolls. But what about regulating things like owning specific types of toys, or banning certain games based purely on local whim? There are historical anecdotes about towns banning specific colors of paint on houses, or regulating the length of grass in your yard down to the inch. Okay, maybe a slight exaggeration, but the impulse was there. It feels like lawmakers were playing a game of legislative whack-a-mole with the universe, trying to impose order on every conceivable micro-chaos that popped into their heads. Trying to explain to your spouse why you can't paint the shed that lovely shade of legally prohibited cerulean must have been a fun conversation. But honey, it matches the flowers. Doesn't matter, Martha. Ordinance 18F bans all shades of blue except regulation sky blue and navy. It's for reasons. Quirky tidbit. One particularly bizarre category of laws often cited from this era involves animals doing specific, unusual things. We've heard the donkey and bathtub story. While likely apocryphal as a widespread law, it reflects a genuine tendency for lawmakers to legislate against specific perceived nuisances, no matter how rare. Other alleged, and possibly real, and isolated instances, laws include banning dogs from barking at the moon. How would you even enforce that? Or prohibiting chickens from crossing the road in certain areas. Maybe the original chicken crossing joke was a legal one. The sheer specificity of these animal-related rules suggests they were born from very particular, local incidents that irked a powerful person or group enough to get a law passed. Imagine the town elder who was kept awake one night by a dog barking at the moon and thought, "Right, that's it. There ought to be a law." And then, bafflingly, there was. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of these truly bizarre, hyper-specific laws was primarily a reflection of genuine, albeit sometimes misplaced, attempts to address local problems and maintain order, or if they were also a symptom of legislative overreach, a lack of standardized legal training, or simply the result of powerful local interests pushing through pet projects, or regulations targeting their personal annoyances. It was likely a complex mix, with the unique circumstances of each community producing its own brand of legal eccentricity. Enforcement of these most bizarre laws was probably inconsistent at best. How often could a constable realistically patrol for dogs barking at the moon or people eating ice cream cones on a Sunday? These laws were likely only enforced sporadically, perhaps when an officer needed to find a reason to find someone, or when a neighbor lodged a specific complaint. Their existence might have served more as a form of social pressure or a reflection of community values than as consistently applied legal statutes. They were the legal equivalent of a sternly worded sign that everyone kind of ignored unless the person who put it up was watching. These bizarre, now forgotten laws, whether real or exaggerated by time, serve as a final, fascinating reminder of the legal landscape of early 20th century America. They show a society grappling with change, anxiety, and the sheer messiness of daily life by attempting to legislate order and control at the most granular level possible. They highlight the power of local government and the unique character of individual communities, each with its own set of worries and its own peculiar legal responses. They are legislative fossils, preserving snapshots of specific problems, fears, and moments of absurdity from a world that felt both familiar and utterly alien. We've journeyed through a world where your bicycle needed a license plate, where spitting could land you in jail, where Sunday was a legal minefield, and where even your hat's size might attract the attention of the authorities. It was a world teeming with rules, many of them specific, strange, and born from the unique challenges and anxieties of a nation in rapid transition. These laws, though often forgotten, offer a unique, sometimes humorous, window into the past, reminding us that the path from there to here was paved with good intentions, bad ideas, genuine fears, and a whole lot of legislative oddities. Now, as the dust settles on our journey through this peculiar legal history, and the sounds of the early 20th century begin to fade, let's gently ease our way back to the present. The streetlights, no longer regulated by laws about specific brightness or climbing children, hum softly outside. The faint sound of traffic, governed by rules far more standardized than those first clumsy automobile ordinances, passes by. The air is still, free from the legal anxieties of public spitting or noisy animals. You are safe here, in the quiet of your own space, free from the risk of violating a long-forgotten ordinance about the proper way to eat ice cream or the legal height of your neighbor's fence. The weight of those strange, specific laws lifts, leaving only the faint echo of a time when everything, it seemed, was someone else's business, and someone else's law. You can relax now. The constables of 1910 are long gone, their rulebooks gathering dust in forgotten archives. The legal minefield has been cleared. You survived.